knowing how to fold cracklings into bread or fry poke salad 3 times to strip the poison before it hit the table, that was knowledge nobody wrote down. Most of it left these kitchens, one funeral at a time. Here are 30 poor man meals from the Great Depression that Black America forgot. Crackling bread fed families in the 1930s the way no cookbook ever acknowledged. When lard was rendered, that slow process of melting hog fat over low heat, the solid bits left behind were called cracklings, and in Black Southern households, not one went to waste. The cracklings were pressed dry, then folded into cornmeal batter with salt and just enough water to hold it together, baked flat in a cast iron skillet or on a greased tin sheet. What came out was dense and spotted with golden pork crisps, salty and rich in a way that carried you through a full day of field work. The cracklings were the byproduct of rendering lard, a weekly chore in households that kept their own hogs, and when pork fat cost almost nothing in the 1930s, this was how a family ate well off what the butcher would have thrown away. You didn't need a recipe, you needed to know what to do with what was left. Before the coffee finished boiling, she had already started the tomato gravy. Flour went into the same skillet where the morning salt pork had just finished frying, the grease still popping, and she worked it fast with a wooden spoon until the flour turned dark honey. Then canned tomatoes went in, mashed by hand, and the pan sizzled into something thick, brick red, smelling of pork and sweet acid. Poured over split biscuits, that gravy soaked in fast, turning the soft bread dark and heavy at the bottom. Tomato gravy over biscuits was a Depression-era staple in Black Southern households from Georgia to Mississippi, a morning meal that cost almost nothing when a tin of tomatoes ran a few cents at the general store. She never measured the flour. She went by how the skillet looked, by a color she had been watching since she was a girl, standing at her own mother's elbow. You can follow the steps. Without her reading that skillet, it never comes out the same. Salt pork and dried field peas was the dish that kept families fed when everything else ran out. Through the worst Depression years, when cash disappeared from Black Southern communities almost entirely, dried field peas sat in burlap sacks in the corner of every kitchen, cheap at 2 or 3 cents a pound, requiring nothing but water, time, and a piece of salt pork to become a meal that stretched across 3 days. The peas soaked overnight, and the next morning, the salt pork went in with fresh water and cooked low for most of the day. The salt slowly worked out of the pork and into the broth, seasoning everything without needing another thing added. By afternoon, the peas had broken just enough to thicken the pot, and the pork had surrendered its fat into a broth, silky under the surface, served over rice or with cornbread. This was a dish that turned the cheapest protein in the county into something that filled you and warmed you through. What started as desperation ended up as the meal everyone quietly missed the most. Nobody outside these kitchens understood what a piece of Fatback could do to a pot of turnip greens, and that was fine, because knowing was half of having. The greens were stripped from their thick center ribs by hand, washed until the water ran clear, and layered into the pot with a good-sized chunk of Fatback, that unsmoked, cured pork belly, cheaper than bacon and twice as powerful in a pot of greens. Cold water went over everything, and the pot went on low heat for 2, sometimes 3 hours, the greens slowly sinking into something dark and silky and savory. The liquid that collected at the bottom, the potlikker, was a tradition rooted in African American cooking traced back to slavery, when that broth was all that was left for the people who had cooked the meal. During the Depression, it was still being drunk straight from a cup, sopped with bread, or saved to season the next pot. The Fatback got pulled out and eaten alongside the greens. Nothing wasted. Everything meant something. But if fatback and greens required knowing what to buy, poke salad required something else. Knowledge that could not be passed through a recipe, only through watching. Pokeweed grew wild along fence lines and roadsides across the Deep South, and during the Depression years, it was one of the few things that grew free and in abundance. The problem, the thing that separated those who knew from those who didn't, was that pokeweed is toxic raw. The greens had to be boiled in a large pot, drained completely, boiled again in fresh water, then drained and boiled a third time, each pass pulling more of the bitter compounds out, until what remained was safe to eat. Dressed with a little bacon grease and vinegar alongside cornbread, it was a full vegetable dish that cost nothing but time and knowledge. You didn't learn poke salad from a book. You learned it standing next to someone who already knew which part of the plant to skip. Corn pone cake with sorghum syrup was the closest thing to dessert that Depression era Black families in the rural South got on an ordinary weekday. The batter was nothing more than coarse cornmeal, water, a pinch of salt, and sometimes a little lard worked in with the fingers. No eggs, no sugar, no milk. It was shaped into a thick, flat round by hand and baked in a greased skillet or on a hot stone near the fire. What came out was dense and golden crusted, slightly gritty, with the deep mineral taste of stone ground meal. The sorghum syrup went on top warm, dark, thick, with a bittersweet edge that was nothing like cane sugar and everything like the South. Sorghum had been a staple crop in the Black Belt region since before emancipation, pressed into syrup in the fall and stored through winter. On mornings when the week's groceries had run thin, a piece of corn pone and a pour of sorghum was both breakfast and supper. Her hands are gone now. The syrup jar is still somewhere in the house. Nobody reaches for it anymore. Stewed, dried okra soup was what you made in January, when the garden was long dead and summer was months behind you. Okra had been carried to the American South through the slave trade. The plant is believed to have originated in Ethiopia and arrived in Black Southern gardens through the transatlantic passage, taking root in soil tended by the same people who had always known how to grow it. But the older women knew to set some aside, threading pods on string, hanging them in a dry place through fall, letting them shrivel to hard pieces that kept through winter without spoiling. When January came and the shells were bare, those dried pods went into a pot with water, salt pork, and whatever else was on hand, cooked low until the okra rehydrated and gave the broth its characteristic thickness. That same silky body fresh okra makes, but deeper and more concentrated. The soup that came out tasted like summer remembered in the middle of cold. In communities where sharecroppers earned less than $1 a day, the cut that showed up on Tuesday was always liver, the one nobody else wanted, the one that sat at the bottom of every butcher's price list, the one that went home with you because it cost almost nothing and the week was already thin. The liver soaked briefly in cold salt water or buttermilk to pull the sharpness out, then went into the cast iron sliced thin with diced onions and a little fatback grease. The trick was heat, high and fast, so the outside browned hard while the inside stayed just tender. Overcooked, liver turns to leather, and everyone in these kitchens knew it. Cooked right, the onions went soft and sweet against the dark, mineral flavor of the meat, and the whole skillet became something worth sitting down for. This was not a dish people talked about when company came. It was the dish that got made when the week was long and the money was gone, and it was enough. She didn't use the oven because she didn't own one. Ashcake was the oldest bread in the Black Southern kitchen, older than cast iron, older than baking powder. And during the Depression, when wood was the only fuel and the fire burned all day anyway, it was still being made in households that had never quite left the last century behind. Cornmeal, water, salt, sometimes a scraping of lard mixed in by hand, then shaped into a thick round wrapped in damp cloth and set directly into the glowing embers at the edge of the fire, covered with hot ash. In 40 minutes, the scorched outer shell got knocked off, and inside was something dense and steaming that tasted of smoke and corn. Booker T. Washington wrote about his mother cooking this way in his 1901 memoir, Up from Slavery, describing the fireplace as the center of his childhood kitchen and the ashcake as a daily bread eaten alongside a small piece of pork, a combination unchanged since before emancipation. By the 1930s, most stoves had moved indoors. In the homes where wood still burned and nothing went to waste, the ashcake was still there. Dried butter beans and the potlikker they made were two different things, and knowing how to use one to get the other, that was the kind of kitchen knowledge that didn't transfer in words. The beans soaked overnight, then went into the pot with a ham hock or salt pork and cooked for most of the afternoon, the water slowly pulling color and salt and fat until it turned gold. The beans themselves split just enough to release their starch and thicken the broth. But the potlikker, the liquid beneath, was its own reward. In African American households, traced back through slavery, potlikker had been drunk separately, sopped with cornbread, given to children and the sick. Research from the National Park Service confirmed that potlikker from peas and greens provided vitamins A, C, and K alongside iron, nutrients that sustained communities who had almost nothing else to draw them from. During the Depression, that knowledge held. The beans filled you. The broth kept you. And if dried butter beans asked for patience, crackling cornbread asked for a different skill, knowing when the cracklings were ready to fold in, how hot the skillet needed to be, how much was enough, and how much turned the whole thing greasy and wrong. This was not baked cornbread. Cast iron heated until a drop of water vanished on contact. The batter, thick with rendered cracklings, folded through it, went in with a sizzle that meant the bottom crust was already forming. It cooked covered, then finished under available heat, coming out with a dark, almost lacquered bottom and a crumb threaded with golden pork crisps. In the Depression-era Black Belt of Alabama and Georgia, cracklings were the byproduct of hog killing season, that late fall community gathering when neighbors came together to butcher and preserve enough pork for the winter. Crackling cornbread was born from that same waste-nothing philosophy. Every scrap had a purpose. Wild rabbit stew with hand-rolled dumplings was Depression-era hunting turned into something close to ceremony. Rabbits were everywhere in the rural South, caught with a wire snare or a single shotgun shell, costing nothing but time and knowing where to look. And when meat of any kind was a luxury, a brace of rabbits could feed a family of 6 for 2 days without spending a dime. The rabbit was skinned, jointed, and dropped into a heavy pot with water, onion, salt, and whatever root vegetables the garden still held. It simmered for most of an afternoon until the meat pulled free of the bones. Then the dumplings went in. Flour, water, salt, worked into a rough dough and dropped by spoonfuls into the broth, where they puffed up soft and soaked through with richness. The pot thickened as they cooked. The last time anyone made this right was the last winter the old man was still alive, and he was the one who knew which fields the rabbits ran. Nobody thought to ask him where. Nobody went back to check. In late October, when the first hard frost had finally come and the persimmons on the tree turned soft and slipped off the branch without being touched, you knew it was time. That was the rule. Not a date on a calendar, not a number of weeks. The frost. Wild persimmons that hadn't been kissed by cold was so astringent they puckered your mouth shut. After the frost, they turned honey sweet and custardy inside, almost like a very ripe fig. Black families across the rural South had been foraging wild persimmons since long before the Depression. The American persimmon, Diospyros virginiana, grew along fence lines and field edges across Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the Carolinas, free for anyone who knew when to go. The ripe fruit was pressed through a sieve to make a thick, dark pulp that got sweetened with a little sorghum and baked into a dense, spiced pudding in a cast iron pan, rich and silky, somewhere between gingerbread and custard, tasting of spice and cold weather sweetness and things pulled free from the wild. It cost nothing but knowing when to go. You didn't pick persimmons, you waited until they came to you. Bone broth, boiled over rice, was one of the simplest and most quietly brilliant Depression-era dishes in Black Southern kitchens. Whatever bones had come off the week's cooking, pork neck, beef knuckle, ham bone with a little meat still clinging, went into a pot of cold water first thing in the morning and sat over low heat for hours, the water slowly pulling out collagen and marrow until the broth turned deep amber by noon. The rice, plain white, long grain, went in for the last stretch, absorbing the broth as it cooked, each grain swollen and rich, and tasting of the week's meals concentrated into one bowl. Bone broth over rice stretched a single set of bones across multiple meals, a Depression-era practice born from necessity. Butchers sold soup bones for almost nothing, and families with relationships got them for the asking. You cooked the meat once, you ate the broth twice, you never threw away a bone. If bone broth boiled rice was about extracting everything from what remained, bread pudding with cane syrup was about refusing to let anything go to waste. Stale bread, the heels, the hardened slices, nobody wanted to eat straight, soaked in whatever liquid was on hand until the crumb softened and absorbed. Eggs went in if you had them, a little sugar if there was any, sometimes nothing but the bread and the water and a pour of cane syrup on top. That thick, dark, slightly smoky southern syrup that tasted exactly like the deep South at harvest time. The pudding baked low and long in a cast iron pan until the top set and caramelized at the edges, and the inside stayed soft and yielding. Bread pudding with cane syrup appeared in Black Southern kitchens through the Depression and far beyond, a dish that turned the end of the loaf into the best part of the meal. She made it every Saturday from whatever bread had gone hard during the week. There are no hard slices anymore. There is no Saturday pudding. Nobody in the neighborhood knew what was in it at first. The bean pie arrived in Black communities in the 1930s through the Nation of Islam, introduced in Detroit when Wallace Fard Muhammad gave the first recipe to NOI leader Elijah Muhammad as part of an effort to move Black Americans away from plantation-era foodways. The filling was navy beans, cooked soft, pressed through a sieve, sweetened with sugar, spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg and vanilla, poured into a flaky crust, and baked until it set into something that looked like sweet potato pie, tasted like custard, and was made from a dried bean that cost almost nothing. The Nation of Islam sold bean pies from storefronts and street corners in Chicago, New York, and Detroit through the 1960s and 70s. The pie was soft, lightly sweet, with a flavor people couldn't quite name until someone told them. Then they couldn't believe a bean had done all of that. Delta tamales arrived in the Mississippi Delta through the cotton fields, one of the quieter migrations in American food history. In the early 1900s, Mexican migrant laborers worked alongside Black sharecroppers in the Delta, and somewhere in the shared labor, the tamale crossed over. Black families adopted the form but changed everything. The masa was made with cornmeal instead of masa harina, filled with ground beef or pork heavily seasoned with chili powder and black pepper, and steamed inside corn shucks, never banana leaves. The result was smaller, denser, and spicier than Mexican tamales, entirely its own thing. By the 1930s, Delta tamales were being sold from hot tamale carts across Greenville, Greenwood, and Clarksdale, a Black-owned street food tradition that fed Depression-era communities for pennies. Blues musicians wrote the tamale into songs. Robert Johnson referenced them in his lyrics. The knowledge of how to make them pass through Black Delta families quietly, generation to generation. Saturday was Salmon Croquette Day, and if you grew up in a Black household during the Depression years, you knew it by the smell before you reached the kitchen. Canned pink salmon, flat tins that cost a few cents and kept indefinitely, got emptied into a bowl, the bones picked out with 2 fingers, the meat flaked and mixed with crumbled crackers or cornmeal, a beaten egg if there was one, diced onion, salt, and black pepper. The mixture got formed into thick patties and fried in a cast iron skillet with hot fatback grease until the outside was deep golden and crackled. Canned salmon croquettes were among the most beloved Depression-era dishes in Black households, an affordable protein that fried up into something far more substantial than a tin of fish had any right to produce. The ritual of picking out the bones was its own kind of patience, the kind you learn beside someone whose hands already knew every spine in every tin. Those hands are gone. The tins are still on the shelf. Roasted ground nuts in molasses were what you made when the week had nothing left to offer, and the only thing in the house was a bag of raw peanuts and a jar of sorghum. Before, peanut butter was a pantry staple. Black families in the Deep South were roasting ground nuts the same way their West African grandparents had, low and slow in a dry pan, shells on, shaken constantly until the oil sweated through. Ground nuts had traveled through the slave trade from West Africa, where they had been a dietary staple for centuries before reaching American soil. The hot roasted peanuts were coated in sorghum or cane molasses and spread on a greased tin to cool until the shell hardened to a crackling candy glaze. Sweet, salty, and deeply satisfying for almost nothing. The children ate them hot, burning their fingers, not caring. Nobody makes them like that anymore. But the sweet always gave way to the bitter in these Depression kitchens, and nothing proved that better than mustard green Potlikker soup, the dish that started as the liquid left in the pot after the greens were done and became a meal entirely its own. Mustard greens went in with salt pork and cold water and cooked for hours until deeply tender, releasing a broth that was pungent and rich, slightly sharp from the mustard greens, silky with rendered pork fat. In African American households since slavery, pot liquor from mustard greens had been consumed as medicine as well as food, a warm cup given to children with colds, to the elderly after illness, to anyone who needed putting back together. During the Depression, the soup stretched further, with cornmeal dumplings dropped directly into the simmering broth, swelling until a cup of liquid became a full bowl of supper. The greens were almost beside the point. The broth was what you were after. Hog killing day was in November, always November, and souse meat was what happened to the parts that couldn't be cured, smoked, or stored any other way. The hog's head, cleaned, split, simmered for hours until the meat fell free, got picked clean by hand, the bits of cheek, ear, tongue, and jowl packed tightly into a pan with vinegar, black pepper, red pepper, and whatever herbs the household kept. By morning, the gelatin from the bones had set the whole mass firm, and it could be sliced cold and thin, pale and speckled, trembling slightly at the cut. Eaten on cornbread or plain, Souse meat was a Depression-era staple in Black Southern communities, a dish that stretched the parts of the animal that cost nothing into something that lasted a week in cold weather without spoiling. You had to know what you were eating. Most people did. Stewed dried peaches with dumplings was the dish that came out of the fruit cellar in February, when the fresh peaches of summer were 6 months gone, and the canned fruit had already been eaten down to the last jar. The dried peaches, sliced thin and dried on cloth in the August sun, paper light and amber colored, went into a pot of water with a little sugar and simmered low until they rehydrated and swelled back into something close to fruit again, the water thickening around them into a pale amber syrup. The dumplings were made the same way they always were: flour, salt, cold water, worked fast, and dropped by a spoon into the simmering fruit, puffing fat and soft and soaked through with peach sweetness in 20 minutes. It was a winter dessert and a way of making August come back in the middle of February. She put the peaches up herself every summer without being asked. When she stopped, nobody thought to start. Sunday morning at her house always started the same way, not with prayer, not with conversation, but with the sound of the skillet hitting the burner and the thick slap of Fatback going in cold. The Fatback went in first, thick-cut slabs of cured salted pork belly that rendered slowly in the dry skillet, pooling fat that turned gold before the meat crisped on both sides and got lifted out to drain on brown paper. The biscuits, big and thick, made without a recipe in a bowl she'd had for decades, went into the oven while the fat was still in the pan. When they came out, split and steaming, the syrup went on top, dark cane syrup, pooling into every split and soaking the bread through until the bottom was dark and sweet and the Fatback sat alongside with its hard, salty crunch. Nobody weighed anything. Nobody set a timer. She knew what done looked like. Those Sunday mornings ended when she did. Church fish fry cornmeal gravy was not a dish most people knew by name. It was a dish people knew by where they were standing when they tasted it, which was always outside, always in the heat, always with a paper plate going soft at the bottom. The fish fry itself was the centerpiece. Catfish, or whatever the deacons had pulled from the river that week, dredged in seasoned cornmeal and fried in large cast iron pots of hot lard over wood fires in the churchyard. But the gravy came from what was left, the seasoned cornmeal that had fallen from the fish into the hot fat, lifted with a little water into a thick, smoky, deeply savory sauce that tasted of the fish and the fire and the fat all at once, poured over rice or cornbread and handed to people who had been standing in the sun since noon. In Black Southern communities from the 1930s through the 50s, the church fish fry was a quarterly gathering that fed entire congregations for almost nothing and built community the way only shared labor and shared food can. But where the fish fry was celebration, cabbage and neckbones was Tuesday. It was the meal that asked nothing except that you show up hungry and willing to wait, because you couldn't rush neckbones, not if you wanted what came out to mean anything. Cracked pork neckbones went into the pot with cold water and cooked low and slow for most of an afternoon, the broth turning almost sticky before the cabbage went in, a whole head quartered, sinking in and cooking down until each layer was silky and saturated with pork. During the Depression years, pork neckbones were among the least expensive cuts at any Southern butcher, and a head of cabbage fed a family of 6 for pennies. What they cooked together over low heat became something that had no business tasting as good as it did. the whole house filled with it, that deep smell of pork and cooked cabbage that meant someone in the kitchen was paying attention. When that smell stopped, something else stopped too. The sound was the first thing, that hard, crackling pop when the salt pork rind hit the hot fat, louder than anything else in a quiet kitchen, a sound that said the grease was ready and the work was almost done. Salt pork skin, the thick rind trimmed from cured side meat, went into deep hot fat and puffed in seconds into blistered, golden, shattering pieces that were salty and fatty and crisp in a way that nothing else in that kitchen could replicate. Eaten alongside a bowl of cold buttermilk into which a piece of leftover cornbread had been crumbled and left to soften, the two together, the hot, shattering rind and the cool, tangy, softened bread, made a combination so specific to Black Depression era Southern cooking that you either grew up knowing it or you didn't know it at all. No restaurant ever put it on a menu. No cookbook bothered to write it down. It existed only inside these kitchens, passed on by watching and tasting and standing close enough to understand. The hands that knew how to read that grease are gone. The sound went with them. Dandelion green salad with the hot bacon grease. Dressing proved more clearly than anything else in these Depression kitchens that survival and pride could occupy the same bowl. Dandelion greens were free, pulled from fields and yards and roadsides, the young tender leaves gathered before the flowers set, washed in cold water and piled on a plate. In the 1930s, Works Progress Administration pamphlets actively recommended dandelion greens as a free, nutritious food, noting the leaves were richer in vitamins A and C and iron than many vegetables families were paying for. The dressing came from the pan right after frying the week's bacon. Hot fat poured directly over the raw greens with a splash of vinegar, wilting them on contact. Served warm, it tasted of something ancient and practical, a dish made from a weed and grease that earned its place at the table. She gathered the greens herself every spring. Nobody goes to those fields anymore. Sweet potato pie was what you brought to the church potluck. Sweet potato pone was what the old women made at home for the family when nobody was watching and the cooking could be honest. The pone had no crust, no molded shape, raw sweet potato grated by hand, mixed with eggs, butter, sugar, cinnamon, and nutmeg, poured into a cast iron skillet and cooked slow until the top set to a dark caramelized crust and the inside stayed dense and custardy. The grating was everything, not sliced, not pureed, but grated, which gave the finished pone a texture somewhere between dense pudding and baked custard, slightly grainy at the edge, silky at the center. Sweet potato pone traced back through African American cooking well before the Depression, documented in Black Southern households from the Reconstruction era forward, and it outlasted Reconstruction in the kitchens of women who never stopped making it the way their mothers had. The pone went out of fashion when cast iron gave way to Pyrex. It disappeared when the old women stopped grating. Some days there was nothing. Not nothing dramatic, just nothing available, nothing affordable, nothing that could be stretched any further than it already had been. On those days in the Depression years, what went on the table in Black Southern households was crackers and cane syrup and nothing else. Plain soda crackers, the cheapest thing in any general store, laid flat on a plate, a pour of dark cane syrup spread thin with the back of a spoon, and that was supper. The syrup soaked into the cracker in a few seconds, softening it, and the combination was sweet and slightly bitter and faintly smoky, the way cane syrup always was, and it was enough to take the edge off hunger without pretending to be a meal. Nobody talked about it afterward, not because it was shameful, it wasn't, but because it was just what the day had offered, and you ate what the day offered and you moved on. The children who ate crackers and syrup on those depression evenings grew up to feed their own kids differently, and their grandchildren never knew a day like it. The knowledge of what that evening tasted like went with the people who lived it. Monday was wash day, and the soup was already on before the first sheet went into the tub. That was the rule in Black Southern households from the Depression through the 1950s. Wash day required both hands and most of your back, which meant the cooking had to take care of itself, which meant the soup pot went on at first light with whatever bones and scraps were left from the week before and cooked without attention until the washing was done. The broth built itself over the morning. Neck bones or ham hocks or marrow bones left from Sunday went in with water, dried peas, if there were any, a piece of onion, salt, and the heel of whatever cornbread had gone hard overnight dropped in to thicken the pot. By noon, when the washing came off the line and the hands could rest, the soup was ready, thick and dark and tasting of everything the week had been, the whole of it condensed into a single bowl. There was no recipe for Monday wash day soup. It was different every week because the week was always different. The women who made it are gone. Mondays are quiet now in ways they never used to be. Fried salt pork and gravy was the breakfast that made something substantial from the cheapest cuts the butcher offered. Salt pork, preserved in brine and packed with fat, could be sliced thin and fried until the edges crisped and the fat rendered into the pan. That rendered fat became the base for gravy, thickened with flour and stretched with water or milk. Poured over biscuits, the gravy turned a few slices of pork into a meal that fed a whole table. The meat was chewy and intensely salty, a flavor children learned to tolerate because there wasn't anything else. This breakfast represented poverty's reality where fresh bacon was too expensive. The gravy smoothed the salt and made everything feel richer. Salt pork gravy was poor food that refused to apologize. Fatback and cabbage was a dish that announced lean times without anyone speaking about money. Fatback, the thick slab of pork fat, was cheap because it contained almost no meat. But when sliced and fried until crispy, then simmered with shredded cabbage, it transformed into something rich, savory, and deeply satisfying. The rendered fat coated every strand of cabbage, giving vegetables a silky texture and porky depth that made them irresistible. Families ate this with cornbread, using the bread to soak up the flavorful potlikker at the bottom of the bowl. It was poor folks' food, but it never tasted like poverty when made by hands that knew how to coax flavor from almost nothing. Children who grew up eating fatback and cabbage carry the memory of that smoky, comforting taste long after circumstances changed. Ketchup sandwiches emerged when refrigerators held nothing but condiments and hope, turning a squeeze bottle into the main course. 2 slices of bread with ketchup spread across them became lunch for children whose families had stretched every dollar past its breaking point. The tangy sweetness gave flavor where none existed, and the red spread looked almost cheerful against pale bread. Kids learned to accept these without complaint because something was better than nothing. Mothers handed them over with quiet resolve, knowing tomorrow might bring better meals. The ketchup provided vitamins and enough taste to make bread worth chewing. There was an unspoken code that no one mocked another child's lunch because everyone had eaten ketchup sandwiches at some point. These meals represented the thin line between hunger and survival. Molasses and biscuits was the breakfast Black children ate when butter was too dear and jam was luxury. Biscuits came from the oven, hot and steaming, split open with fingers, their soft insides waiting to soak up whatever sweetness was available. Molasses, thick and dark, was drizzled from jars that sat on every poor family's table because it cost less than sugar. The flavor was earthy and deeply sweet, almost smoky, coating the tongue with richness that white sugar never matched. Children poked holes in their biscuits and watched the molasses pool before each bite. It was simple food carrying centuries of tradition. Molasses provided iron that growing children needed. This wasn't dessert, but breakfast, a reminder that poverty didn't mean going without something sweet. Syrup. Sandwiches were the sweet solution when the pantry held nothing but bread and a bottle of caro or pancake syrup. Children watched as mothers folded soft white bread around thick drizzles of golden syrup, creating a sticky, filling meal that satisfied cravings for both dinner and dessert. The syrup soaked into the bread, making it soft and almost cake-like, helping children pretend they were eating something special. There was no protein, no vegetables, nothing nutritious beyond calories, but it was enough to send kids to bed without hunger pains. Syrup sandwiches appeared when paychecks stretched too thin. They were eaten quickly and never mentioned outside the home. For children who grew up on them, the taste of cheap corn syrup still triggers memories of lean times when sweetness was the only comfort available. Potted meat on crackers was the lunch that came from small tins stacked in pantry corners, affordable protein requiring no refrigeration or cooking. The pinkish paste was spread across saltines, each assembled carefully to stretch the tin as far as possible. Children ate them in sequence, the salty crunch giving way to soft, vaguely meaty filling that tasted like survival itself. Potted meat cost pennies and lasted months on shelves, making it reliable when fresh food was out of reach. Mothers packed these crackers in napkins, sending children to school with humble but filling lunches. The taste was distinctive, slightly metallic, but satisfying in ways only necessity could explain. The small tins represented ingenuity, turning shelf-stable ingredients into meals that kept families fed through the hardest weeks. Potlikker and cornbread was breakfast born from last night's greens, the rich broth saved because throwing it away meant wasting nourishment itself. After collards simmered all day with ham hocks, the liquid left behind was dark, salty, and packed with vitamins that poor families desperately needed. Mothers heated it up and served it with crumbled cornbread soaking in the middle. Children sipped it like soup, the cornbread dissolving into something soft and savory that warmed them inside out. This wasn't just thrift, but wisdom, stretching one pot of greens into 2 meals when money was scarce. The broth carried iron from the greens and flavor from the pork. Families believed it gave strength for the day ahead. Potlikker breakfast was proof that nothing in a poor kitchen ever went to waste. Neckbones and rice was the meal that turned discarded cuts of pork into something that could feed an entire family for days. Butchers sold neckbones, cheap because most customers walked past them, but Black mothers knew the secret hidden in those bony scraps. Slow cooked for hours with onions, garlic, and bay leaves, the neckbones released rich marrow into a thick gravy that clung to every grain of rice. Children learned to work around the bones, pulling tender meat from crevices. The dish required patience and skill, transforming poverty into something that tasted like Sunday dinner. Neckbones stretched the food budget further than ground beef ever could, and leftovers tasted even better the next day. This was survival cooking at its finest, turning what others discarded into meals that filled bellies and warmed souls. Sugar sandwiches represented pure survival wrapped in sweetness, a lunch that cost almost nothing but delivered calories desperate bodies needed. White bread was spread with butter or margarine, then sprinkled generously with sugar until the surface sparkled. Children bit into the soft bread and felt granules dissolve on their tongues, a moment of sweetness in difficult days. Mothers made these knowing sugar provided quick energy even when protein was out of reach. In neighborhoods where food stamps ran out before the month did, sugar sandwiches appeared without explanation. Kids ate them gratefully, licking their fingers clean. The sandwich was proof that parents would find ways to feed their children no matter how little they had. Sugar sandwiches carried no pretense, just honest sustenance born from necessity and love. Sugar bread was the breakfast treat that cost almost nothing but made children feel special. A slice of white bread was spread with butter or margarine, then sprinkled with white sugar until it sparkled. Sometimes it was eaten cold, the sugar crunching with every bite. Other times, mothers toasted it under the broiler until the sugar melted into a thin, caramelized crust. Either way, it was sweet and satisfying, a moment of joy for children who didn't have candy or store-bought treats. The cost was pennies, but the happiness was real. Sugar bread appeared in lunch boxes and on breakfast plates when that's all there was. It was poor kid food that felt like indulgence, turning plain bread into something worth anticipating. This breakfast reminded children that sweetness didn't require money. These kitchens fed generations on almost nothing and left no instructions behind. Like and subscribe, and tell us whose table you learned it from.